Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are in South Africa, good afternoon. For those of you in North America, good morning. It is a wonderful pleasure to welcome you this afternoon in this special webinar. I am especially privileged to be in conversation with two women whom I admire, whose work I admire greatly. Very especially Professor Deborah Willis, whom I have not been in conversation with before until we were preparing for this, and Professor Tamar Gab, who is not a stranger to us in Stellenbosch. She has been our guest for many times, at least 3 times, 4 times, I remember. So it is a real wonderful pleasure, and we're in for a great treat. What makes it special today, especially, is that in South Africa, this is Women's Month. Women's Month celebrates the struggles of women in the 1950s for freedom and for their rights. At the same time, interestingly, at the same time, in the United States, it's the centenary of the proclamation of the freedom to vote for Black women in the August of 1920. And so we're very privileged because Professor Willis has been very engaged with this history, with this past, with the memory of it, and representing it through bringing back those photographs. So she'll share a little bit with us about that. But before they speak, I would like to introduce them. First, Professor Tamar Gab. Professor Gab is an acclaimed scholar, an art historian. She is a Durning Lawrence professor, the Durning Lawrence professor in the history of arts at University College London. She graduated from the Michaelis School of Fine Arts at UCT with a BA and 2 MAs, one in art education from the Institute of Education at the University of London, and a second one in art history from the Court Lord Institute of Art. Her PhD was also in Court Lord Institute, where she began her academic career. Professor Gab's research interests have focused on questions of gender and sexuality, women artists and the body in the 19th and 20th century, as well as more recently in post-apartheid culture and the arts in South Africa. She has published extensively in her field, and her key publications include The Body in Time, Figures of Femininity in Late 19th Century France, The Painted Face, Portraits of Women in France, 1814 to 1914, Bodies of Modernity, Figure and Flesh in Fin de Siècle, France, and Sisters of the Brush, Women's Artistic Culture in Late 19th Century Paris. Professor Gab has curated the exhibitions in South Africa, landmarks, or from works in South Africa, landmarks, homelands, contemporary art from South Africa, and figures and fictions, contemporary South African photography. The last one, the second exhibition, was nominated for a prestigious award, the Lucy Award, which honors the most outstanding achievements in photography around the globe. Another exhibition she has curated is Distance and Desire, Encounters with the African Archive at the Walter Collection, New York. Her exhibitions have been in London, in New York, all over the globe, in Paris and in South Africa. So welcome to you this afternoon, Professor Gab. It is afternoon for you in the UK. She is speaking from London. And now, Professor Deborah Willis. Professor Willis is a photographic historian. She has been described as a pioneering photo historian ahead of her time, a scholar at the forefront of scholarship on African American art and photography. At New York University, she is a professor and chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts. And she has an affiliation as well in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis in Africana Studies, where she teaches courses on photography and imaging, iconicity, and cultural histories. She's been a curator of several projects. Her curating and photographs and prints at Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library was between 1980 and 1992, so it ran for a period. Then she became a curator at the Center for African American History and Culture of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. I think it's important to note that this was a precursor to the exhibition, the permanent exhibits at the Museum of African American History and Culture of at Washington, D.C. And she led that project between 2000 and 2001. And when finally this was established, the museum was established, she continued to work with the museum, and she is an advisor and a consultant even currently. She then has had a number of books, about more than 15 books. I counted, I think close to 20. Among her acclaimed publications are Reflections in Black, A History of Black Photographers, 1840 to the present. Now, this one has been exhibited and ran for a period of 3 years in the US. And this is known as an exhibition that has cultivated a national appetite for African American photography and transformational scholarship. She is described in these terms, transformational. She's a mentor for many artists, and this work led to her being awarded the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship in 2000. Ladies and gentlemen, the list of achievements of these two women is too long. I have to cut it. I have to clip both of their achievements because of time, but we will hear more about their work during this afternoon's conversations. I want to start, given that it's August and it's a celebratory month in the US and in our country as well. I want to start with you, Deb, and ask you this idea of photography. Both of your works, it's photography that dates back, it's curating works that is from the past. What is it that is important for us in the present about this part? What does it tell us? Why is it so important for us to be looking at visual images about Black people in history? And what is it that they tell us, and why is it so important? And if you could tell us also about the significance of these photographs for women at this time in the US.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and I wish I could be there. It's just an important year. We think about the 100th anniversary celebration of the suffrage movement, but it's also a critical year to think about Black women who have fought for the right to vote, fought for citizenship, but ignored in the larger press and the historical texts. So this is an important year also for the archive. There are a number of archives that are opening up, and writers and artists are entering into the archive, creating new stories, looking at ways to talk about Black women activism. So in terms of connecting to your month of women's celebration, this is an important year for us as well here in the States. And I also curated an exhibition for the Park Avenue Armory that focuses on the activism of women. And some of the artists are also looking at Asian women first vote, Native American as well as African American and white women who voted for the first time, and using that work to create a sense of energy and synergy to celebrate their fight, but also to tell the story of the difficulties. So it's really a central time to think about that. And I'm an artist and also interested in the text. So thinking about how we think about how the arts are essential in telling and using the archive. And that's why it's such an important time for us to consider this work and this time.
And what's fascinating is that in this time, these works, these images are published in some of the leading newspapers globally. And you were just telling me earlier that your work has now been featured in The Guardian. And we saw last week that it also appeared in the New York Times. It's amazing that these images are now finding pride of place in these very important publications globally.
Yes, and also Vogue magazine. So when we think about not only the political critical press, we're also looking at how Vogue magazine is opening up another discussion for people who are interested in culture as well. So it's a broader audience, and it's a way for us to rethink how not only the camera and recognize this history. So it's a wonderful time for all of us at this time.
Mm. Both of you have been engaged with bodies. I mean, it was when I was reading Tamar's publications, the bodies, femininity, the feminine, the gender. But it's also you really are concerned about issues of social justice. The recognition of the importance of women in the world, and especially of Black women, both of you. And so I'm very curious to know, Tamar, what inspires you? What draws you to this work that involves, speaking and writing and representing works around women?
Thank you, Pumla. Thank you so much for inviting me to be in this conversation. It's such a pleasure to be here with both you and Deb in dialogue. I think, what's so important is that the image of women as allegories, as metaphors, as symbols have been around, as we all know, forever. But what has been silenced is the voice of women. So women as active agents, women as makers of meaning, women as producing knowledge, women as having a very particular vantage point from which to speak and navigate history. That is not the same as the ubiquity of the presence of the bodies of women, through which culture has forever tried to articulate meaning. So I think that what's really interesting for us is both to investigate the terms through which women historically have been understood and represented, and not to accept those terms as final and definitive, but to understand them as politically loaded, as pregnant with meaning that often in itself tells us a lot about the societies that we live in. But then also to look at what happens when women's voice is placed in front of us, when women question, critique, problematize, open up to investigation that plethora of images and projections through which our bodies have been understood. And I think both Deb and I in our work over the years have looked both at representational structures through which the feminine is understood, but also very importantly at what happens to history, to society, to politics when women's voices are heard and listened to. And art is one of the vehicles through which that can be articulated.
It's really so.
Can I add to that, just in terms of that history? So Tamar just brought up a history that I grew up in North Philadelphia in the 1950s and 60s, looking at television and the absence of Black presence. But when we saw Black people on television, it transformed many of us. And my mother had a beauty shop, but also to think about South Africa. South Africa was a central place for us as we looked at the experience of women, and specifically Mary Makeba, was a signal for us. She was a symbol for us as in terms of freedom, in terms of style and voice. So I'm so connected to the female body because of growing up at a time when women were not known for their voices, but also but known for their presence and breaking barriers.
So in relation to that, of course, growing up at that very time in South Africa, what we faced was the complete invisibilization, to use a horrible verb, of the voice of Black women, except in, in relation to very, very particular, very circumscribed tropes around domestic workers, the figure of the nanny, etc. So as a child growing up in suburban South Africa, we were deprived. There was no television, as you know, and voices like Miriam Makeba's were banned. So the diet that one was fed was a very circumscribed diet of idealized projections and images of either Black or white femininity and different forms of femininity. But, it took a lot of looking and shouting and screaming to break apart the tyranny of invisibility, I think. And that goes back, Pumla, to your question, what fired one to learn and to understand beyond the filters of ignorance that were imposed upon us all is what I think compels us to continue looking.
It's a different kind of gaze. I mean, this kind of gaze on the Black body, either as a sexual object or as a violated object. You bringing up an important perspective, as women concerned about these issues of social justice, and especially now, in the wake of the George Floyd incident, where again we were witnessing the violation of the Black body, and how one then moves from that representation of the dehumanized, violated body of Black body to a much more proud representation, showing the images that you have shared, both of you. I mean, we've seen your work, Tamar, when you were with us, and Deb, just looking through your work. This idea that there is this dignity, this sense of dignity that has not been represented, in the Black book, because the gaze has been different. But you have not only been concerned with the politics of image or the art even of image. You've been concerned also about the everyday life of the everydayness of Black life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think storytelling for me is important. It gives a sense of empowerment, and having that opportunity to think about everyday life, just getting up in the morning, to feel pride in the work that we all do. And so these photographs are evidence, because the absence of the image and only one or one type of image that shows Black people, we're subjected to all kinds of craziness in terms of the imagined image of Black people. And that's why the archive is so important.
And the image is so incredibly powerful. It teaches us who we are. It teaches us what we can aspire to. It teaches us what is legitimate and what is illegitimate in its own terms. So to prize apart and to break open the enforced orthodoxies of image production is often a matter of life and death. The image is not incidental or, entertainment or there to somehow just make one's life more tolerable. We are all informed by images that circulate around us. And as Deb, mentioned Vogue magazine, the fact that Vogue magazine now has a Black editor, and that you see Black bodies in Vogue magazine and on the cover, and that this, troubles the received histories and conventions that, little girls imbibe from early on, and that we live with throughout our adult lives as well. We're tyrannized as well as enabled through images that pervade our culture. So to be involved in visual politics is to be involved right at the, at the cliff face of what it is to be alive and to find a voice.
Wonderful. So I'm going to hand over to Deb and invite you to share your presentation. But while you do that, I'm going to do some housekeeping stuff while you're loading your PowerPoint. So welcome again, everyone, to all of you who are here. We would like at this point to invite you to please just shout out on the chat screen who you are, where you are from, just so we know who's in the room with us and our panelists can know where you all come from. So please just drop in a message of hello to everyone on the chat screen, please. When you are asking questions, when you have a question to ask, please don't post it on the chat screen, post it on the Q&A screen. Landi Meireng is managing the questions in the background and will answer all technical questions. Unison Mugamu, whom you can see there, is a researcher in our research unit. He is also a member of our historical trauma and transformation team, and he will be, I'll call on him. Hopefully, I will not need to call on him when there's a technical glitch. The last thing I want to say about the Q&A is that sometimes Landi invites people to come on board and join the panel when they want to be visible, when they ask their questions. I just can't, you know, I don't remember what the word she uses, or is to promote. She promotes panelists, promotes members of the audience to a panelist, and you can join as a panelist to ask your question. And she will be managing all of that in the background, and she'll just put you on the screen when the time comes. I think that's all for the housekeeping information at this point. Thank you very much. We see all the people saying hello from various parts of the globe and from our own country, all corners of South Africa. It's wonderful to see everyone. All the provinces are represented here, people from the UK, people from the US, Midwest, this one says. So thank you very much for obliging us and sharing who you are. Really are grateful that you're all here. Thank you very much. Deb?
Yes, so
It's yours.
Okay. Thank you for setting this up. I also I'm going to walk through about 15 minutes of images. I want us to think about the power of images, but to think about the importance of how these images have transformed our lives and society, but also what these images mean visually and politically. But the title of your project, these are the things that sit with us, is central. And when I read that title, I thought so much about this history. So we begin, I always want to also acknowledge the photographers. You know, I want to acknowledge the range of photographers who are there. So I'm celebrating this in terms of creating a sense of who's out there photographing, and happy that there are Black photographers, white photographers, women photographers in this central story. Looking at this history also is to remember and recall the work of Peter Magubani, who was one of my central figures as a mentor when I was studying photography and asking questions and trying to relate the work of the anti-apartheid movement with the civil rights movement, and what happens with these images and how photographers were central in placing their bodies within the center of the storytelling. When we think about this image of Sharpeville, the massacre in South Africa, this image basically was on the news in not only in South Africa, I'm sure, but also how it affected us in America, seeing this aspect of what we can see now and relate to that history about Black death, how police violence and Black death when seeing these images. But then also thinking about the archives of the people who lived the experience, but also can tell the experience today, and why it's important to have contemporary photographers use their lens, use their skills to interview some of the people. And here again, these are some of the images from the book, but also to talk about the memory of the beatings and the memory of constructing that story, but also having access to the medical archive, but also with a sense of pride that we survived and we're telling this story in different ways, ways of telling it through not only dress, looking at the work from connecting these images to Dr. Martin Luther King, arrested, trying to vote, trying to, work with communities in terms of representing what the movement and documenting the experience. But one of the things that respectability was an important lens and language for Black people in America to look at this, and as photographers documented Dr. King dressed, hat on, arrested, walking through the act. And also when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, what happened when Leonard Freed photographed him in Baltimore, his hand, no one's looking at his face, but they wanted to touch his hand because of this sense of a biblical moment. When you think about the fact that he's reaching out, he understands the importance of what his hand means to this community. But look at the faces of the people here. We also see that in the March on Washington, Leonard Freed, again, central to telling the story through sound and music. Why music is important, because it kept people going. And that sense of resistance through joy, that we're going to make this through. And the aspect of that is central. So we see this group of women and girls, the aspect of police violence through Charles Moore's photograph of a man who, again, as we think about dress and fashion and the sense of what it means to be respected because of dress, and then these cops, German Shepherd, pulling off the clothes of this young man here. And the contemporary photographer, Hank Willis Thomas, looks at that image and create a three-dimensional image of this experience, making art to remind us of this archive and this archival history. We also think about this image here, that how music is central, where Max Roach is working with Oscar Brown and Abby Lincoln and Olatunji and Coleman Hawkins. We insist, in terms of 1960, and this was also thinking about the freedom movement. This is a photograph that was used from that time period, from the lunch counters, segregating the lunch counters. So we see how important this aspect of music, what it meant for young people. And we see the young people's movement today, connecting that history of young men and women students who want to make a difference with their voice. Ernest Withers photographing First Vote, the pride that these men and women who are having this opportunity to see, making a choice for the first time, who they're going to vote for. With Fannie Lou Hamer, Bruce Davidson's photograph. Again, women, at the front line, pearl earrings, cardigan sweaters, dramatic pose, but you could see the strength that they had in the fight. Malcolm X, again, in Harlem, talking to the community, teaching them about the aspect of visual representation, what it means to fight for their freedom within this experience. And we have the 60s, the early 60s with Malcolm X, to the later 60s with the Black Panther Party, as again, looking at this group of young people who are making a difference in Oakland. We also have the Young Lords in Manhattan, and they have their demands. There's 7 demands where they're looking for fair housing, fair education, employment, all of that experience. And we see this range of stories where photographers are there creating these stories. And this is the images that, so where people had to vote, the Sugar Shack. So there was a juke joint at night, and in the daytime, there were education for how to vote and plan these voting moments, where police also in Philadelphia, stripping young men in the street, So these photographers were photographing these moments. Life magazine with Angela Davis on the cover, creating a narrative, the making of a fugitive. What does that mean? On top of a line of another headline, the sculptor of Matisse. So we think about how Life magazine, luckily we had Ebony magazine. Here again, Hank Willis Thomas is looking at the archive of a photograph of Ernest Withers at the Sanitation March. Here we say, I am a man, thinking about how men had to walk through this history of streets of Memphis. I am a man asking the question. Hank is looking also at the same image and creating posters like those and creating a poem about this. And then at the end, I am a man, I am, and I am a man. So just in terms of looking at identity. Here, older men, again, I can't express enough how important it was for the necessity for dress. Yes, he's a sanitation worker, but also I am a man, I am human. Gordon Parks' photograph with the segregation signs, a young woman with her niece on a Sunday afternoon in the colored entrance doorway. So we see these students also. Here again, we see students in talking about Anti-Apartheid Day in Texas. So we know that as a central story around the world, we're looking at student movements and how photographers such as Margaret Burke White, we know her as a photojournalist in many ways, but following her images of stop police terror. So here again, we began to see how important it was for well-known photographers in our communities, Black photographers as well, to look at these demonstrations in other cities and other countries, and here in London, in South Africa, and here Ernest Cole's photograph, documenting a man who has to show his ID card. So the range of terror is seen in different ways. So these are some of the moments, and just ending up with Sheila Pree Bright, contemporary photographer photographing in Atlanta. The images of, just say her name, and remembering how we have to remember the names of women. We think about Breonna Taylor today, but we again looking at Sheila Pree Bright's work, stop profiling, stop criminalizing, stop mass incarceration. So these are the moments why these are important, and ending with Carrie Mae Weems, who is constantly looking at this history and asking the question in these public monuments, and asking that sense of what do we do to make a difference? And the difference is this struggle that we talked about, and it's all in our psyche of experience of how do we explore this civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid movement with the images that have created a sense of looking at why we need to remember Black death, violence, and to make a difference for changing the world in terms of policies. So wanted to end with this last image here.
You're mute, Pumla.
Thank you so much, Deb, for these really evocative and powerful images. I can't help thinking about, for you as artists, the role of the audience. Just every single image that you showed, I had a memory, most of them, there was a memory associated with it. And some of what I think and feel as a memory is actually not a memory. It's something that it's almost, it's part of my identity, in that I'm responding to the pain, the visual pain, on the screen, as if it's something that has happened to me, So this is so important for the dialogue with these images. One such image that are so evocative for me is the image by Hank Thomas Willis, who is your son. We have to say, we must tell the audience here, those who don't know. That image, the three-dimensional image in conversation with the the ripping apart of the man's pants who is protesting. That image is so even much more than the actual original image itself. It's so much more, the response is so visceral that you feel the anger, the violence to the body, and just this pulling of this body and the tearing apart of the limbs and the clothing. That this image is so much about the aggression that has been visited upon Black bodies. And what happens then, to audiences, because it does evoke a memory, whether it's actually one's memory or a memory that is passed on to one's intergenerationally. What happens to audience? How do you respond to the potential for the eruption of violence in reaction to these kinds of images because of memory, because of what they remind one of?
Well, the emotions are a range. So that piece is in an exhibition now in Cincinnati, but I saw it in Portland, and it's amazing that it was in Portland and Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, and some people walk through and can't imagine that history. They can't imagine this could happen, and this is a younger generation, and then there's a generation of people who are angry that this has happened, and how could someone just sit there and not stop the police. So what Hank is trying to do with this reopening the archives is to say that we can't forget, and if we do forget, it will happen again. And if we begin to think about how do we deal with despair based on this trauma, we need to have action, and the action is made within the political realm. And that's why it's important when we think of Kamala Harris today with this history, the change that's going to happen. And so our responsibility is that we need to look, we need to not forget, we need to acknowledge.
Tamara?
Yeah, I was just thinking though, but also what Hank does so effectively in his work is then to channel the anger and the knowledge. Because going back to your question, Pumla, unmediated anger is going to just reproduce the violence. And we've all heard about the horror of the victim becoming the victimizer, and the getting locked into a binary from which there is no escape. We talked about this a lot last year at the conference in Stellenbosch with Jessica Benjamin, talking about beyond the categories of doer and done to. So how do we think historically in a way that absolutely understands the power relations and who is culpable and who is not, at the same time as not falling into a trap of reproducing that violence and becoming that which you abhor? And I think that so the space of art and the space of creativity, any kind of creativity, whether it's creativity in terms of writing or performing or one's relationships or making, provides a space through which to produce knowledge, self-knowledge and knowledge of the situation one is living through and history that hopefully allows us to break those circuits of violence. And that's what I think, anger, is important and powerful emotion, but anger unchanneled is very dangerous. And so that's, my feeling is that that's how we need to think with ourselves, our students, our friends, in order to find a way to acknowledge the hurt and the pain, but not to fall into the trap.
And that's one of the points that Hank often talks about. He does not enter this work from anger. He enters the work from a question. When we think about who's going to look at this image and the hope that these young people have for their future. And that's something that's the question that centers around his work. And it becomes an important framework to think about how do we move forward outside of this sense of of anger, because he looks at it by acknowledging the history, but also that we need to question, why is this happening?
And for the two of you, before we move to Tamar's presentation, isn't it also the ultimate question is, how does one become human in the aftermath of these atrocities? You know, last week we had a really fascinating presentation by Yvonne O'War, who wrote the book Dust, which really talks about these cycles that Tamar, you're referring, these cycles of violence, that we come from a history of colonial violence, and then the violence is repeated in various forms by those who take on power, and then it trickles down to the society. So there is this question really that in the final analysis, how does one reclaim one's sense of humanity, you know, in the context of these kinds of histories?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the ways is to make. You know, the process of making is part of what makes one human.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can think of art as not some kind of mystified realm, but the realm through which human beings make meaning materially, then that does provide a space for thinking and reconceptualizing the past and who one is. So, you know, I think the realm of art making is so fundamental. It's not an add-on. It's not a luxury.
Mm-hmm.
I wish our politicians would understand that.
Yeah.
It's fundamental to what it is to being human.
And supports the arts.
Mm-hmm.
Tamar, at this point, I'd like to invite you to share your presentation, please.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen if I can. Give me a second. Right, can you all see this?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I had the advantage of seeing Deb's presentation in advance. I didn't know what she was going to say, but I was really lucky enough to see that. So what I'm going to do is to think through some of the questions raised by the concept of visual politics and what it is to navigate violent histories, but also I hope to address some of the images, Deb, that you shared with us. And I wanted to start off with two, you might say on the surface, inconsequential insofar as they're not spectacularly images of violence, but they are nevertheless images, I think, that actually represent the kind of violence and violation to everyday experience and everyday life that characterized apartheid South Africa in ways that are much more quiet but no less violent than the spectacular image of police brutality, for example, which I'm going to go on to. There's a kind of quietness here. On the left, you see Ernest Cole's representation of signage in a bank. And on the right, a Jürgen Schadeberg photograph of the destruction of Sophiatown. And so the infrastructure of daily life, for example, is represented in apartheid era signage, or as you showed, Deb, in the signage that still persisted in the American South, you know, way into the 50s and 60s. That forms a kind of violent infrastructure, you might say, through which daily life has got to be lived. And similarly, in the image on the right, the destruction of home and community and forced removal involves a kind of violence and violation with which people live throughout their lives. And one of the themes that emerges in the book that we'll talk about in a minute, these are the things that sit with us, is the residual pain and suffering that kind of displacement and dispossession involved. So when we think about navigating violent histories, I think we think both about those overt, spectacular forms of violence, but also the insidious violence of the everyday through which human life is conducted. And I suppose I was thinking a lot about this in relation to questions of visibility and invisibility, because so much of that spectacular image bank, really, of that photography has given us is about the visible threat to safety and the integrity of the human body. But I was reminded of a sentence by our beloved friend and now lost great South African photographer, Santa Mofa King, who in 2011, in the preface to the catalogue Chasing Shadows, says these words: "If apartheid was a scourge, the new threat is a virus. Invisible perils both." And I was thinking about the question of invisibility in relation to so hypervisible a medium as photography, and particularly in relation to the virus now, thinking about this invisible menace that circulates around us, and how and where it manifests itself. Where does it become visible? And what is the role of the photographic in relation to those forms of visibility and invisibility? I think in 2011, it's interesting to think what Mofa King might have been referring to, whether he was referring to still the long residual effects of AIDS on communities or other kinds of violence that exist within communities, which he's seeing in terms of a virus. Of course, the spectacular conjunction, you might say, of Black Lives Matter on the one hand in the wake, particularly in the wake of the death of George Floyd, but going back, of course, many years before that, the conjunction of that with the kind of inequities that we know that the virus has made visible, seem to me to be brilliantly articulated in this rather extraordinary and powerful protest image of this young woman. In the words, "I can't breathe," one gets this extraordinary conjunction. The words of George Floyd, the last words of George Floyd, the physical suffocation of that human being through the brutality of that police officer, and the complicity, you might say, of the officers surrounding him. That on the one hand, and then the fact, of course, that COVID is a respiratory disease, and it involves the suffocation, the deprivation of oxygen as one of its primary symptoms, not the only, but one of its primary symptoms. So the question of who has the right to breathe, who has the power to snuff out one's breath, is something that I think is very, very vividly present with us now. And the disproportionate way in which Black and minority populations are impacted by COVID and by the pandemic comes together at this point of the extreme expression of racial injustice that we see all over the world, really. Particularly, I'm thinking of the United Kingdom and the United States of America, but with its own particular kind of history in South Africa. So photography has the power to, in an incredibly pithy image, bring together complex forms of signification in this one image. Here we are in the level of the spectacular image, or faced with a spectacular image. Photography is an extremely economical means of bringing this kind of overt message to visibility. And these are the some of the images that Deb showed us, showing how this kind of spectacular use of images in protests, in posters, in forms of visual advocacy are so powerfully captured through photographs. So it's very interesting in this context here to look at these images which come from different places in the world, but which reference shared agendas, and to see that photography can create synergies in a very diverse world. And through technology, the photographic or the poster or rituals, protests and forms of being in urban space, certain kinds of parallels, you might say, and conjunctions are set up in different places in the world. But I think that, and here's another example. I took the cue from Deb's presentation to pick up the I Am a Man protest from 1968, and then to see it in comparison with the 1956 women's protest. The women are all in front. We stand by our leaders in relation to the treason trial. Now you look at those two photographs, and there's huge amounts that they have in common in terms of technology, in terms of the way in which they use the camera, the frontality of the shot, where the camera man or woman is, probably a man in those days, standing and looking at this group of people, what the role of photography is brings together at a formal and technical and technological level these two very, very distinctive events. And that is a great gift, you might say, and it's to do also with the way in which we curate these things and juxtapose them. But I think that there are certain dangers in doing that too. And I suppose I wanted to just alert us to thinking with those dangers for a minute. One of the things it can do is destroy the particularity and the distinctiveness and the difference of different historical situations. So whilst, yes, we can talk about the oppression of Black people across the world, and we can talk about shared histories and narratives and origin stories, we also need to pay attention, I think, to the particularity of the situation within which these images are produced, so that we don't homogenize very, very different experiences. And one of the things, Deb, that struck me when I was just listening to talk a minute ago about the role of images is, of course, in South Africa under apartheid, images were forbidden us. We did not see images of Sharpeville. We did not see images of protest. We did not see images of Nelson Mandela even. These were banned in South Africa. So we lived in a culture that took images very, very seriously. So much so that we had this incredibly tyrannical system of censorship, which means that our relationship to this historical archive is different. We're positioned differently to it. We have come to know this archive belatedly. We have had to salvage an archive that has been repressed, much of which has been destroyed, much of which was taken out of the country and kept elsewhere. So I think it's really interesting to think about those similarities, but also to think about the particularity of our relationship to those archives from our particular situations. Now, of course, the work of this kind of photography in terms of bringing the attention of the world to the plight of South Africans was absolutely fundamental. And without the bravery of photographers going out to document what was going on in social life, and without the edited projects like Beyond the Barricades and The Cordoned Heart, important books that were sponsored and circulated, the world would not have known, and you would not have been involved in the anti-apartheid struggle and protest that we've seen represented here. Of course, the situation in South Africa was so very, very different. But again, so here's another question. In looking at these images as symptomatic of the brutality and the systemic and orchestrated violence of Nationalist Party rule in South Africa during that period, sometimes that can make us not look closely at each of these images themselves. And I was very struck by this image that you brought, Deb, to my attention. It was not an image that I really knew. And I was struck, as you were, with the unbelievable violence that is encapsulated at that moment of tearing that we see the dog perform. And I was also struck at the same time by another detail in the photograph, which relates to your first image, which is the photographers who were there at the scene, who were witnessing the scene. And the question that we ask about their relationship to that scene, are these press photographers? They look like professional people in their jackets and ties. They don't look like insurgents or clandestine photographers, or those who are going to smuggle the images out of the country. I don't know, some people might even be able to identify those figures. But the role of photography in the face of this kind of violence opens up all sorts of questions. We think about the person who took that film of George Floyd, which galvanized the world in a way because of the way in which it was relayed on our screens. The relationship between photography and the spectacle of violence is so interesting. And I think too, with this particular image that you showed, this image of spectacular violence again, brutality and police brutality at the Sharpeville massacre. But I stared long and hard at this photograph from looking at your presentation. And I did what I always like to do with photographs, is to try to see what they yield beyond the overt declarative first impression message of the photograph. And so I started to look at the details. There we have the photograph. And obviously one's attention is drawn to the violence encapsulated in that hand, that raised hand of the police officer beating down on that person in that shower of dust, and you get the sense, the atmosphere, don't you, of the dusty environment. But then I also became fascinated by the figure in the front and started to wonder who he was. And of course, what becomes very clear to one when you look at the photograph is that it's a black police officer. And we can see this not only because we see his complexion, but we see the kind of hat. There was a hierarchy in the police force in terms of who could wear what. And, you know, here we have a black body. But going back, Pumla, to what you were saying in the beginning, this is not now from our retrospective historical positions, this is not the heroic black body we want to see. This opens up different kinds of historical questions about how apartheid functioned, how it was so tenacious, who was corralled into operating in the service of the apartheid era infrastructure. And we know from the work of historians, I'm talking about work of people like Jacob Dlamini or Saul Dubois, that there were many black police officers at Sharpeville. So what do we do with those kinds of painful histories? You know, Jacob Dlamini's work on the Askari and on collaboration and who is a perpetuator, who is a bystander, how does history work, and how have people been corralled into functioning in ways that produce very uncomfortable histories? Well, photographs are extremely rich documents, and they often tell us so much more than we set out to discover. And I found, just staring at this photograph, this to be a very disturbing but interesting a way of looking. And then I started looking at some of the other photographs by Ernest Cole. You raised Ernest Cole as an extraordinary chronicler of life under apartheid, not only those spectacular forms of violence, but the daily you know, infringements on people's freedom and the daily assaults really on people's humanity, and looked at this during a sweep. Again, this very, very interesting interaction between people. Here you have the white bystander with his hands in his pocket, you have the domestic worker, you have this interesting encounter between the young boy, looks like a teenager, and the black police officer, who is corralled into enforcing the tyranny of apartheid era law. And what do we do with that in our history? This produces, I think, a very painful archive, and something that's worth thinking about. And then the other image on the right of the screen here is one that I find extremely painful, really, and difficult. Here you have the black woman scrubbing the floor of the white ladies' toilets. So you have here the whites only ladies signage at the top, but you also have the body from the back of this woman. And Ernest Cole was very good at picking out the details of daily life. I mean, he looked for these kinds of quiet, invisible, or barely visible forms of violation to bring to visibility. And it struck me as so interesting in relation to the Gordon Parks photograph. And this goes, Deb, to what you were saying about dress. I looked up this photograph after I looked at your presentation, and there's an account of the son of this particular woman who says that his mum always required that they dress very smartly when they went out. Otherwise, people would think they were, I can't remember the word he used, maids, maybe, servants. So that's also a form of violence, how you have to think, the anxiety of not falling in to those stereotypes and those you know, figurations really of one's subjectivity, and how that's defended against. So the thing about photographs, I think that's also really fascinating, is it depends what you put them next to. They can generate so many different meanings depending on how you juxtapose them. So this juxtaposition asks us to think in a particular way. But if we look at this juxtaposition, here we have the cover of Ernest Cole's book, and there you see that photograph in the top right-hand corner on the page in a whole section called For Whites Only. And here it signifies in relation to the plethora of apartheid-era signage, which itself constitutes a form of violence. If, on the other hand, you juxtapose it with Leslie Lawson's book on working women in South Africa and her representation, this bizarre representation of a woman polishing a boardroom table. Then you think about it in relation to issues of labor and the black body as the laboring body that services the wealth of South Africa, really. That is the ultimate form of invisibility, I think, for so many decades of the work to which women were put through all those years. So gets back to the question of visibility and invisibility, which I think is so very interesting. And Santam Mofokeng himself is really, really interesting in thinking about this, because he moves from being a press photographer interested in this kind of representation of struggle and spectacular violence to the photographer who is interested in the interstices of daily life, of endurance, of how people survive and function in a system which is in itself systemically violent. And his Train Church series is just one of those. So thinking then about the book that you have brought out, I mean, what strikes me so interestingly about this book is that so many of the photographs produced by the photographers with whom you have worked really speak to the invisibility of violence and to the aftermath, really, how people live with historical violence, and how the very fabric of the material and social structure which people live in perpetuates those forms of violence, or at least its residues remain in place, even in the most subtle forms. They're there in poverty, they're in the kinds of scars people bear internally, they're there in memory, they're there in relationships, they're there in loss. And how does photography really articulate that? I mean, that's one of the things that your book, I think, tries to explore. So we have the extraordinary stories of people who have lived through, in some cases, exceptional lives, and in other cases, ordinary lives. But that is a moot distinction. It's not, you might say that every life is an extraordinary life. Look, for example, at the case of Esther Senga, a domestic worker who's photographed here in her front garden, working the soil. But when you read what she says, she talks about having been a domestic worker and how you had to put your overall on and your head wrap, and how the madam wanted to keep these things away from you, and how you had to eat out of a separate bowl, how you had to take your bowl outside and rinse it. And that daily insidious form of having to behave in a way that conformed to the norms of the time is, to me, the ultimate form of violence. So of course she is exposed to a bomb, and that's the second most graphic form of violence. But both of these forms of violence form who she is, and it's in relation to both those forms of violence that I think the photographs have something to say. I'm going to finish soon. I know I shouldn't go on too long, but I was interested, just because, taking again, Deb, from your cue, the way that contemporary art is a site for thinking about these historical roles and figurations. And Zanele Maholi's Somnyama Ngonyama series is a key instance of what it is to occupy these historical roles. So Zanele's mother, Bester, was a domestic worker. And there's a beautiful film in which Zanele goes back to the home of her mother's employers, the Harding family. Her mother raised the Harding children rather than raising her own. And the way in which Moholi deals with this is to take up some of the, rather playfully, you might say, some of the props of domestic life, from the clothes peg to the, what do you call it, scouring pad, and reconfigure themselves in a way that both registers those historical figurations, but also claims a voice by repurposing them. So going back to this thing of what it is to look at the past, to look at the archive, and then to reclaim it. I have more, but I don't know whether you want me to stop now, whether you want me to finish, Pamela. You can tell me what you want. Shall I finish? Okay. So the book is interesting in the sense that, as I say, it registers both of these ways of thinking about what violence is and what violation is. So you do have instances, for example, here with Fahmida Young, who wanted to bury an activist, a young South African youth activist, Ashley Krill, and who couldn't for various reasons. The story will tell you why. And you see the proud way in which she, as an elder woman now at the bottom, holds up the photograph of her former self. So those personal archival images, the archive exists everywhere, not only in institutions, it exists in our albums, it exists under our beds, it exists on our mantelpieces. We all have those archives. And here we have somebody repurposing that archive and in a sense treasuring a historic image. And I wanted to finish just with a couple of recent projects, which then bring us full circle back to the more declarative, spectacular form of protests and ritualized public activism, and what photography can do and how we might use photographs to help us understand those. So the Rhodes Must Fall movement obviously has been so fundamental to the Black Lives Matter movement and to a way in which we think about the relationship between these forms of activism and political protest across the world. And so I think it's quite interesting, given Deb's focus on the civil rights movement, to see the way in which these movements are entangled, the way in which the anti-apartheid movement could have taken sustenance from the civil rights movement, the way in which the Black Lives Matter movement can take sustenance from the Rhodes Must Fall movement, particularly in relation to monuments. So David Goldblatt's photograph is one that's now become iconic for a number of different reasons. And I love it as a photograph because of the way in which it captures that moment that Cecil John Rhodes is plucked from his plinth and dangles like a mascot, like a toy, in the air, his power seeming to be in some way shrunken, like his figure, because of the perspective of the photograph. I love it also because of the way in which it registers our time. You have all these young people holding their mobile phones up, taking the photograph of the moment, and you realize that we live in a culture in which photography is ubiquitous. Everybody is a photographer now, and everybody curates their own personal archive. But the thing I like about photographs too is, as I said earlier when I was looking at the Sharpeville photograph, they often tell us things that their creator didn't intend. Photographs have a way of having things seep into the picture that sometimes undermine the logic of the picture itself. And this one to me has a very particularly interesting way in which I know that Goldblatt would not have intended. If you look at all those young people holding their cameras up to photograph, I would challenge you to try and find more than maybe 3 women in the crowd. I see one on the back on the left hand, there are a few, but it is an overwhelmingly masculine crowd. And I was alerted to this not only by staring at photographs for a long time, which is what I do, but also having seen the play, The Fall, that was produced from the Baxter Theatre and came to London, in which the issue of the gendering of the Fallist movement is a huge one, where some of the characters talk about the way in which a certain patriarchal narrative has taken over this particular protest movement, and the feeling amongst various women and people and non-binary people that their struggles are not being listened to. And in looking at this photograph, I know it's not what David Goldblatt intended, I thought how inadvertently the kind of masculinism of this moment seems to be articulated here. Whether you could look at it from another angle and see something different. I'm not saying that this is the definitive truth, because photographs don't give us the truth. They give us a version of history. And I see that very interestingly here. And just to end, it's very interesting to contrast with this image, which is Sethembile Msazani's extraordinary, now also iconic image of Chapangu, the African eagle associated with the Great Zimbabwe and with pre-colonial Africa. She did a performance at the moment of Rhodes being taken off. You see him dangling there again, where she seems to be rising, Africa rising, women rising, Black women rising, Black women's visibility in the midst of this particular extraordinarily powerful moment. So this is a very interesting answer, you might say, to the Goldblatt representation of the event. But there's something in here too that I think is really interesting, and I am sure that Msazani was not conscious of and didn't intend. And that is, I mean, obviously, overtly, this is a celebration of Black women's power, and a really important one at that. But if you look at the hands that are raised around the body of the woman who is rising, they come in many shades and complexions. And I found that profoundly moving, that we can all touch hands, not in the time of COVID, hopefully again soon, to raise our collective protective shield. And we've seen that a lot in the Black Lives Matter protests as well, around this new phenomenon of a new subjectivity giving prominence and place. And so I take hope, I suppose, in seeing that multi-hued, non-racialized, really, I don't know, form of celebration that surrounds the body of Sethembile Msazani rising as Rhodes falls. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tamar, so much, and for bringing us to this point, and the last point you raised about the importance of the solidarity of anti-racism. You know, that now we're entering this phase of a new movement of an anti-racist solidarity, which is what, in a way, you know, telling these stories, representing these past in this way, brings people together. But I'm conscious of time, and I would like Deb to respond to Tamar before we open it to the floor. But if you allow me, Deb, just for a moment, to explain to people what these things, these are the things that Sit With Us is about, because you both referred to it. It's a book that we have published at Stellenbosch in our research unit. And the book is a book of excerpts of narratives of people who lived through apartheid. And the goal of the book is really and the reason that we wanted you to have this conversation is to help give us insights on how might we archive these kinds of, you know, of stories with the images, the photographs that you have shared. And the wonderful thing for us about this is that we are inserting a narrative at Stellenbosch, you know, whether it is in archival narrative or in the digital space, on the digital space, or not. It's the possibility that we can engage with these kinds of stories at Stellenbosch with its history of apartheid, and that the space is opening up at Stellenbosch is something to really talk about. It's something that at least we should be conscious of, that here is this university associated in its history with apartheid, with Verwoerd himself having been at the university, being all the connections, you know, to apartheid. And yet at this moment, there is this possibility that has opened up, that we can have these stories, we can archive this kind of stories at Stellenbosch. And so this is where we are moving with these kinds of stories. And thank you for bringing to our consciousness these possibilities. So now I want to invite you, Deb, if you could also unmute yourself before you speak, and we'll see how far we go before we invite the audience.
Right, I know that we want to hear the audience as well. So I'm just going to just say just a few words. I thought it was really important to think about where, in terms of placing the Black body, in terms of the police in these images, in terms of access, active body, passive body, the image of the Black policeman standing back, and the other gestures of the white police as they're beating and hitting the bodies that are bent over and confronting the police brutality. So when we think about the narratives that's going on in your archive, it's really important to also think of the institutions that are housing some of these archives. And I really find it really important that the photographers' archives are central, as well as, and I'm going back to looking at Drum magazine and Ebony magazine and Jet magazine, that were and as well as Life, but these were the three magazines that really focused on Black culture, but also the politics of this notion of police brutality, the experience of violence and segregation and apartheid, as well as how do we look at surveillance during that time period. And we see it through not only that, as Tamar looked at the 3-4 men in the back with the Charles Moore photograph, and to see where those images are, where they are today. Looking and thinking about the images of Gordon Parks, and then the importance of the Gordon Parks Foundation is for us to not only internalize and reconsider the perspective of the images today. It's really important to think about, like we think about viral Black death today because of these, because of the handheld phones. But when we think about the images of the photographers, once we get into that archive and what you could do to show all of this, this in terms of a worldwide reflection on these images, we can think about social justice in a different way. And hopefully with all of the narratives about how do we tell this story about, I'm always looking for the joy in the madness, and how the creativity in this experience. And we think through the experience of Max Roach to the sonic experience of the singers and the people even in Soweto and in Sharpsville. They had a movement, and the movement was choreographed in the sense of dance and movement and in the marches. So we really see, against all odds, these bodies were moving and fighting in different ways. So I recognize the sense in this humanity in these images. So I think we should open up to the questions. So
yeah.
Landy,
is there someone coming up? Thank you, Deb. Landy in the background, is there someone who's coming up, or shall I read?
Yes, Pierre's coming up.
Okay, Pierre, please.
Thanks, it's muted.
Hi, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we can. Welcome, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is a great occasion, and it was a real pleasure to hear both of you and to see the amazing images that I find very inspirational. I'm picking up on something that Ravilis mentioned in relation to the photograph of Martin Luther King. And, but I think it's kind of relevant to both your thoughts on what photography can do. I'm interested in the spontaneous collaborative moment where the photographer and photographed are in the process of making history. In that moment of Martin Luther King's arrest, he's consciously also soliciting the camera to document the violence done to him. And there's this split second of like being in the action as a victim, but also aware somehow on the sidelines of being a subject of a portrait. And I'm interested in what you think on this kind of moment where you are embroiled in something that is traumatic and really difficult to experience, but you're also soliciting the documentation of that violence in a sort of moment of collaboration with the photographer, and almost regardless of whether they're like a newspaper hack or somebody who's sympathetic with the movement, because there is this need or this awareness in that moment that somehow this moment that you're experiencing is important for political posterity. And I think that goes only for those photographs that showed protest movements where the violence can be expected. I mean, obviously when something spontaneously erupts, you can't be aware of those moments. You might not even see that you're being photographed. So yeah, I would be very interested in responses from both of you on that.
Well, I think that looking at that image, I'm often thinking about the representation of resistance. How do we represent and preserve resistance? And how do we represent that is something that I believe that Dr. King is performing in that sense. Mm-hmm. But also that so many Black people were killed in the middle of the night. You know, they were taken out of their beds, undressed, lynched, unknown for the public to know, only to see the violence of their death at the end. And for Dr. King to actually recognize and implement this opportunity to say, okay, I'm resisting, I'm fully dressed, but I'm saying this in a public arena so that other people can see this is happening, because so many Black people died in the middle of the night, and the silence of the only families that were there. In terms of, we go back to the title of the book, you know, things that we sit with. And that's why I think that this is an important sense of reading it as a collaboration, an active collaboration between photographer, but also reader of the image as well. The fact that Tamar said that there were no images circulating during that time, but at the same time in Black America, we heard about these images, we saw the images, we knew the photographers, and so it's just that kind of what that silence means in the hands of the people who receive the images.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting. I'm sure they were circulating clandestinely, but they certainly weren't circulating in any official publications. And, you know, and there was danger. Images were dangerous things. Images are dangerous things. To be in possession of the wrong kind of image could have caused you incredible harm and your family harm. And so we need to understand that. But yeah, I would just say, Bear, that just it's every photograph requires one to address its particularity, both in terms of its situatedness and in terms of the visual rhetorics that the photograph invites us to recognize. I mean, I was struck, Deb, when you were talking about that photograph of Dr. King, when you talked about the hand, and I was thinking, I didn't see that. How stupid. I looked at that photograph in your presentation before. Maybe I just went by it too quickly because I had in my head, oh, that's that iconic moment in Dr. King's life, move on to the next photograph. But we have very, very formulated systems of receiving these photographs and narratives that are already extremely well rehearsed. And we see the photographs often through those filters and narratives. So stopping to look, and as you said it, I saw so much. I saw God creating Adam in the Sistine Chapel. I saw the hand on the hand. I saw, you know, the touch. I saw a whole series of forms of care that were contained in the tension between those hands and what can touch. And you could write a whole article on that, on the hand in that photograph. So you opened my eyes to seeing that. And so I would say that each photograph requires us to look at it in that way, and it will put pressure on those conventions of looking that we all carry with us.
It's amazing what photographs evoke. As you're speaking, I'm thinking of a biblical text, you know, the touching of Christ's robe, or people clamoring around Christ wanting to touch him. It's interesting what images evoke. There's a quite, thank you very much, Pierre. The question, from Ayanda Ngusani, when we speak about the everyday archive and the binary between formal archive and everyday archive, such as interviews and photographs, how would you suggest students in their dissertation phase encourage their supervisors to honor the alternative archive?
That's a hard question.
Great. Yeah, it's hard, but it's a great question.
Because text was much more important to my professors than the image. And so that's where I would recommend that the student become the teacher, to bring in images as evidence and to teach the teacher how to read an image and what it incites and what it resists and what it explains. And it's a struggle, but don't give up, because it's something that I spent a lifetime experiencing every time I had to retell a story and challenge the narrative of text. So just kind of, how do we read? You can read text as differently as you can read the experience of an image, and that's something that we have to offer.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think I think in some ways it's easier. Certainly, when I was, studying art history, there was an incredible hierarchical notion of what images and works of art were worth considering and which weren't. And certainly family photographs and personal archives never came anywhere near the picture. You couldn't say, I'm going to do my dissertation on, the family portraiture of my grandparents or their journey from here to there or whatever it was. I mean, this would not have been regarded as remotely possible. Whereas I think it is the case that now there's an increasing literature on family photography, on vernacular photography, on, informal material culture, when often you have to look at anthropological literature or literature from other disciplines. People are using photographs in life writing, and sometimes they use them effectively, sometimes they use them quite crassly. We can discriminate, but I think absolutely, I think that increasingly there is license now for people to bring those materials to the academy and to ask us to think differently because of the evidence that they read there.
We have 2 minutes, but I do want to read. There's so many questions that are here, but there's one that I think is important for us, given that these photographs are so evocative, and sometimes we are living the memory, we're living the past. It's not just the past that's gone and past, the violence continues. So one mother asked Ayanda Nyoka, she says, I'm a mother, I'm raising a young Black boy, and he's slowly coming to race consciousness. How might we as parents who want to inform our children about this history, particularly from a perspective of healing consciousness, work through these images with our children so we won't wound them? Perhaps more broadly, those working with younger kids, how might we work with these kinds of images to avoid a re-wounding of our children?
I don't even think is re-wounding. I raised a young Black man, and at 2, as he says, I remember, Mom, you said, yes, you're a young Black boy, what you need to do. But I was raised that way. My father was a cop. So he knew the injustices in the, quote, Justice Department. And so being able to talk freely with your child, even through the notion of, we know that there are problems there, to talk about images, to talk about what to expect. It's a sad state of affairs, but we need to be able to talk openly with our children about injustice. And fortunately, it helped transform some of the young people that I know, because we keep the story alive, and at the same time, as I said, bring joy in these stories. And I love the images that you showed of the spiritual moments on the train. You know, what happens when we have moments on the train of solidarity, of people reading the Bible or singing songs or going to work and finding whatever that they can find joy in these moments of difficulty. So I just continue to let your child know what's going on in the world, but also know what's the possibilities that are available. But I would also wanted to find out, is there a way that we could see the questions, or you could send us the questions and we could respond in a different, on chat afterwards?
Yes, you will receive the link to this Zoom webinar, and it will come with the questions. So you'll see the questions.
People who wanted to get a response, is a possibility that we could respond to them then, or send it to you for a response?
Lanti, I think let me read one question, okay, and then they will send others. The one has asked about the image. This person was struck. His name is Mark Williams. He was struck most by what Ernest Pearl, non-European teller image, and the white man who is only seen from bridge of his nose up through line of invisibility is horrifically and blatantly evident in the pathology of white people. The gaze is only on the inhumanity experience as opposed to the hand or the eyes that hold the shambok. I suppose, I mean, it's a long sentence, but in the end, the person says, in terms of white people, we can't even get to a homogenized pathology, let alone a particularized pathology. Is that not the invisibility that remains, that there are no compelling market forces that would demand that particularly now?
Well, I mean, that's obviously a whole series of complex assertions one would want to unpack in that interesting question. And of course, that photograph, appears in House of Bondage. It's mediated in a particular way. It's cut in a particular way. We know from looking at Ernest Cole's archive that when you look at the photographs in other contexts and the way in which they're printed in other contexts, that's the other thing, remember, with photographs. They are altered often depending on the context. So, one would want to think with that photograph at length to see what's going on there. And I'd be really fascinated to look close and long at that photograph and to think about it. But what I would resist is instrumentalizing and weaponizing the photograph to service a particular kind of very dogmatic reading, because I think then you blind yourself from seeing the possibilities of photographs. So I'd need to look long and hard at that photograph to see what's going on in the exchange of gazes and hands and touch in it. And would love, that's what we do in our classrooms all the time. And that's what teaching art is. That's why it's such a wonderful thing to do, because one's pushed and asked to think again and to question one's assumptions around images.
You know what Deb was saying about the photo, how we should hold on to the hope and not focus on the destruction and the violence, that even in the midst of the violation, there are these moments where communities build themselves, connect to one another, build a sense of solidarity. I was very struck by this when I was at the Museum of African American History and Culture, that it's, I mean, we call it for short, those of us who come from outside, is the American History of Slavery Museum. And yet, when you go in there, you see so much richness of the human. There is that history, but there is so much of the human in the midst of that. And, there's so many reminders of women like yourselves, Toni Morrison, who writes about the importance of reclaiming our sense of humanity, even when there is violence. And I think this is what the message that you really are leaving us with. And perhaps, Deb, to invite you to emphasize that message even more, especially at times like this. We need to hear more of that message. So perhaps if you could just wrap up for us and speak to that issue.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And next time, we hope we'll see each other face to face.
Thank you. Tamar is coming back and we'll continue the conversation. I know you're coming to Steers and we will have this conversation again. Thank you so much for your willingness to come, both of you, all the way from the US and all the way from London. And thank you to you, the audience. We had a wonderful conversation and we're really very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.